There we go. So we're now recording. Good morning again, everyone. Welcome to Dear Editor, our ongoing conversation series about scientific writing and publishing. This morning, I'm joined by David Ferris, who is a librarian here in the Research Medical Library. And we're going to be talking to you about the NIH Data Sharing and Management Plan, which is a very important component of your grant proposal. So with that, I'm just going to turn it over to David. So go ahead.
Thanks, Erica. So I'd like to wish you all a good morning and thank you for attending this morning's presentation. As Erica mentioned, my name is David Ferris and I'm one of the Research Services librarians. It is my pleasure to give you an overview of the updated NIH data management and sharing policy. I'm glad to offer some guidance on how to comply with the policy when preparing your grant proposal. And I'm very happy to share some additional resources to help you develop, write, and implement your plan. So before we begin on our journey, here's a poll I'd like you to participate in. Are you aware, how much do you know about the 2023 policy? Let's give you about 30 seconds. So hopefully that you all had enough time to submit your answer. Thank you, Erica, for sharing. So it looks like we've got a full range of folks here. Some are very familiar, that's great. Some know a little bit, some are vaguely aware. What's the policy? I understand that question. And what is NIH? Yeah, that's fun too. I'll let you know that the NIH is the National Institutes of Health, of which the National Cancer Institute, NCI, is one, the National Library of Medicine is one, and it includes 9 others. There's 11 of them, I believe. Okay, I'm going to close the poll. And so in order to understand, click again. Whoops. So in order to understand why the DMS policy was issued, I think it's good to think about the purpose of sharing scientific findings, that is, making science open. Open science promotes accessible, reproducible, and transparent research, which is important not only for the advancement of science, but also its integrity and credibility. As we know, way back in BC times before COVID in 2008, the NIH began requiring authors to share their final peer-reviewed journal manuscripts that arise from NIH funds. And now it has updated its 2003 data sharing policy to include scientific data generated from NIH-funded research to provide access to high-value data sets, to enable the validation of the research results, and to promote data reuse for future research studies. So kind of what does this mean in plain, simple English? The 2003 data sharing policy applied to scientific data generated from NIH grants of $500,000 in funding or more. But the 2023 data management and sharing policy now applies to scientific data generated from most NIH grants, regardless of the amount of the award. So grants that require a DMS plan include research projects and some specific career development grants. However, there are some grants that are exempt from the DMS plan. including training and fellowship grants. I'm pretty sure that within the grant application for that specific grant, it will indicate whether a DMS plan, a data management and sharing plan, is required or not. I could be wrong, but I would imagine that's where the requirements for the entire application would be. So before we look at the elements of the plan, we need to understand how NIH defines scientific data, because they have a very specific definition of what scientific data is. So according to the DMS policy to the NIH, scientific data is the recorded factual material commonly accepted in the scientific community as of sufficient quality to validate and replicate research findings, regardless of whether the data are used to support scholarly publications. So scientific data includes data needed to validate and replicate research findings, and the types of scientific data will vary depending on the project and the context of the proposed research. So again, let's cut through the jargon. And what does this mean? So basically, just like with the NIH public access policy, where accepted peer-reviewed manuscripts are that have arisen from NIH funding, they must be shared, uploaded to PMC, either via the journal publisher or the NIMS system. Now, so too the data that underlines that study. So essentially, you have to include both. And let's look at some examples of scientific data. So one example is that's one example of the data that scientific data that is subject to sharing includes a single cell RNA sequencing of T lymphocytes or other immune cells in a study of HIV or AIDS. fRMI images in a study of a rodent model in an experiment of post-traumatic stress disorder. STEP activity from a wearable device in a cardiovascular health study. These are just some of the examples, and they relate to specific kinds of research. So research for cancer may very well include different kinds of data, probably like genomic data, I would imagine, that kind of thing. But there are some examples of data that's not considered scientific data, and that includes electronic laboratory notebooks and physical objects such as laboratory specimens. We find that envelopes leak, and there's no way currently to upload specimens to the cloud. So keep those in your lab, please. And the other thing is your draft of your manuscript. This is not considered scientific data. You do not need to include it in your information to upload to a data repository. This will become subject to the NIH public access policy once it has been accepted for publication. Are there any questions so far about scientific data or anything that I've mentioned before? This has all kind of been preliminary background information.
I haven't seen anything in, oh, there we do have a question in chat. Feel free to ask any questions you need to as we're going along in the chat, and we can always, I can always pass those along to David if he doesn't see them. We do have a question in the chat, it looks like. What about animal survival and tumor size as far as types of data, I think is the question.
Again, I'm not specifically sure what, if that is considered scientific data. I would imagine it would be, but I'm not an expert. I do not work in a lab, nor do I collect that kind of data. I think it's basically depends on the type of grant and then the type of data.
Right.
If it agrees with the definition. Erica, you have
right.
something?
No, I was just going to say if your outcome measure, for instance, is tumor size, if that's like something you're trying to compare between groups, you're probably going to be recording that someplace, like not just in your lab notebook, but in a database somewhere. And I think that's the sort of thing that would apply here. Another question somebody else asked about flow cytometry data. Again, I think it depends on the context and the experiment. If that's something that is integral to the results that you're going to analyze, probably that's something you'd be recording somewhere in a database. It really comes down to where you're recording it, I would say. So I think that gives you some idea. Again, yeah, animal survival, same sort of idea. If you're looking at, if you're comparing like the survival rates or the survival times or whatever between your animal groups and recording it in a database, that's probably something you'd want to share somewhere.
Interesting. It's in terms of the context of the data and the research. Interesting. Thanks. Thank you, Erica, for jumping in. This is also following up along those lines. Not all data generating during a project are required to be shared. There are times when scientific data cannot be shared, such as patients' protected health information. So when you are thinking about what kind of data is this, does it need to be shared? Think about the context of the research that you're doing. And if you still have a question, please ask us and we can try to help answer your question or steer you in a direction to people who can answer it. So in order to comply with the data management and sharing policy, each DMS plan must include 6 elements. So let's look at those. Number 1 is the types of data that will be collected and shared. Number 2, any software, code, or specialized tools that's required to access and work with the shared data. Any standards that will be applied to the scientific data and metadata, such as specific data formats, data dictionaries, and other data documentation. Plans and timelines for data preservation and access. This includes the name of the data repository where your scientific data, metadata arising from the project will be archived, how the scientific data will be findable and identifiable. For example, does the data repository assign a persistent unique identifier or other standard indexing tool so your data set can be findable? And when the scientific data will be made available to other users and for how long. Number 5 is any factors that may affect subsequent access, distribution, or reuse of the scientific data related to informed consent, the privacy and confidentiality protections that are regulated by law, the applicable laws, regulations, and policies, and any restrictions that are imposed by those. Whether access to the scientific data derived from humans will be controlled. For instance, some of the information may be shared, but it would have to be DNA anonymized, for example. Another part of this element, any other considerations that may limit the extent of data sharing. And for our final element, it is compliance and oversight. So how and by whom compliance with the plan will be monitored and managed, and the frequency of the oversight. So it's not just saying we will do this. And it's terms of, it's like ongoing, the frequency of oversight, how is it going to be oversight, what is the oversight, how often it will be monitored, managed, that kind of thing. So we've discussed the DMS policy and the 6 required elements. So I'd like to look at some resources to help you write your data management and sharing plan. So the NIH scientific data sharing website has an incredible amount of information about the DMS policy, including resources for writing a DMS plan, budgeting for the plan, sharing the data, and a whole lot more. I encourage you to explore this entire site, but I'd like to highlight 2 items on the Writing Data Management and Sharing Plan page that I think will be very helpful. The first item provides a detailed explanation of each element, which will be useful for understanding the types of information that are to be included in each element. The second, for instance, here, so when the first element is data type, I'm going to show you a tool in a little bit that's going to help make this a bit easier, but you're still going to want to look at this page to kind of get a definition of what they're talking about and maybe some examples. The other resource that I think is really helpful, they've got sample plans, I think 12 of them. And they're all related to kind of specific but general kinds of projects that would be requesting funding. So you can go through and look at them, see which one most kind of is related to your project in terms of, like, is it genomic data from human research participants? Are you doing an animal study, for example? And it looks like this. It's a sample plan. So please do not copy and paste or think that this is possible to use as a template and upload. To apply for your grant. It's only a sample. It just gives you sort of a little bit more context in terms of, the explanation in types of data in the 6 elements. But then this is what it could look like in terms of how do you describe what is the information you put into each of these elements. Let's see. So those are external resources, and there's a lot of them. It's as you would imagine, it's a government website. It's very resource rich. But I'd like to share some internal resources that have been collected and one in particular that's created specifically to help MD Anderson employees prepare their DMS plan. So the Office of Sponsored Programs has created a storefront on the intranet that has an incredible amount of information for MD Anderson employees applying for grants. As you can see, this is just scrolling down halfway down the page for this particular tab. There is a lot more information and links available below this. And a lot of the information is taken directly from the NIH data sharing website that we just looked at. So in a way, it's going to help lead you back to the official source. But I think it's been a bit curated in terms of you don't need to look at everything on the website. Look at this link, look at this, and this will help answer potentially some questions. But I want to bring your attention to something that I think is, to me, I think it's an incredibly helpful tool that will save a lot of effort and time when writing. And it's this. It's the MD Anderson NIH DMS template. It is a Word document. It is downloadable. And I'd like to show you what this looks like. Let's have a look at it. So first, notice the green text. This information for each element is to be completed by the user. And so if it's in green, that's the information that needs to be supplied. And we've mentioned there's 6 elements, and you only need to add information to 3 of the elements. The first element, which includes the types and amounts of data that will be collected, documented, and shared. Element 2, any software, code, or specialized tools required to access and work with the data, such as, the program language, R, data analytics tools such as Deduce, and coding tools such as atlas.ti. And the last one is element 4, the plans and timelines for data preservation and access. This includes selecting a data repository that complies with the NIH DMS policy recommendations. For example, to use our example from earlier, a repository that assigns a unique persistent identifier to the data set, one that provides free and easy access, and has a documented data retention policy. These are just some of the characteristics that they recommend. But the OSP, what I really like about this is that the OSP has already created the boilerplate text for each element. So in a way, you don't really need to reinvent the wheel here. If this is applicable to your research, they've already entered the information, for instance, some of the text for how is it going to be managed, how is it going to be formatted, the data is going to be formatted, that kind of thing. So I think you can edit this, of course, if you like, if it needs to be changed a little bit to match your project. But in a nutshell, 3 elements. Element 1 has 3 parts. Basically, it's on the just 5 little sections, and pretty much you're done. Of course, I think the time will actually be in terms of how to describe the data and where does it fit. So far, we've had a brief overview of the NIH data management and sharing policy. I've shared some basic information on how to comply with the policy when preparing your grant proposal. But as with all applications and policies that involve funding, especially from the government and other very large institutions, there is a whole lot more granular information to consider when developing and writing your data management and sharing plan. It's really not possible to cover all of the DMS policy details in a 30-minute presentation. So you might wonder where you can get some answers to your questions when you're in the middle of writing your plan. So you're in the heat of battle, a question arises. Who can you turn to? Well, I invite you to turn to the library. The Research Medical Library offers many services to MD Anderson employees. And you might find these particular services to be helpful with data management and sharing policy. So first, we have librarians who are happy to meet with you to answer the questions you may have about compliance and creating your plan. The library also has a team of scientific editors who are glad to edit your data management and sharing plan along with your grant. And finally, if you have any questions or need additional assistance, please contact us. The library staff are available Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. We actively monitor and respond to all of these ways to contact us. If you contact us outside of business hours, we will respond bright and early the next business day. If we don't know the answer to your question, chances are we might know who in the institution who can help you. Probably one of our biggest resources in terms of that would be the Office of Sponsored Programs, since I believe, although I'm not certain, you don't actually apply, you don't submit your grant directly to NIH. I believe you submit it to the OSP office so they can review, make sure everything's in order, and then they submit. So that leads us to any questions.
Yes, there is a question in the chat. When all data is collected in one, like in a clinical study, is it recommended to share it in different databases per data type? For example, patient-reported outcomes in one database and data on biomarkers in another database. I'm not sure that I can personally tell you that it should be one way or another. I think that's, allowed if it makes sense to do that. It seems to me the way that this policy is worded, they just want you to explain where the data are, where they're available, whether or not they're available, or why. I think as long as you justify it, it can be maybe done either way. That's my impression, but anybody else, feel free to jump in on this one. I haven't seen from what the way the policy is worded that it's like it has to be one way or another.
I agree. I think, well, as with all policies that are coming from very large, complex institutions, there's a great deal of flexibility, room in it. But yes, as Erica said, as long as you're complying and justifying what you're doing, chances are you're safe, you're good. But also, if I also understand correctly, once you are awarded the grant, you're having to submit regularly updates, maybe an annual report, about your progress and that kind of thing. But in one of the documents that you can update, that you're expected to update if any changes happen, is the data management and sharing plan. So if you change, your data changes you selected a different repository, anything, it's kind of like a living document in terms of you update that. So that also is something to think about.
Yeah. Yes, I think that covers it. A kind of related question is data management part of a review? I think maybe that's what we were getting at with that previous question too, is are you recommended to do, have all your data in one place or in a couple of places? Like, will it affect the fundability of your grant? Maybe that's what you're getting at with that question. I don't think so. My understanding with this is you have to have the management plan. You have to, address the things that they want you to address, or you're going to be in some trouble there. But as far as like how is it like we're funding this grant or that grant based on the data management plan? I don't think so. I think the things that they're looking for within your grant are the same as before. This is simply like it's a required element that you have to have along with your proposal. Again, anyone else on the session this morning who has a better sense, feel free to jump in, but that's my understanding of it. Another question was, can you share the data sharing plan working draft? I believe,
Absolutely.
yeah,
I mean, it's
that's in the
downloadable.
resources, right? Yeah.
Correct. That we have a digital handout for you guys that have links to everything we've covered here, and one of which is the OSP website and that template. It is a Word document. You download it and you can edit it completely.
Yes.
I'd like to add something a little bit to the previous question. You reminded me of something. I did see somewhere on the NIH data sharing website that or maybe it's the webinar when they were rolling this out, but they were talking about, how do they evaluate this plan in relation to funding. So I have not had time yet to go back and look at that. It's very interesting. I'm very curious. I imagine this is more of a requirement, and as long as it's organized, they recommend it's no longer than 2 pages. So as long as you're meeting all the requirements, it looks kind of right. It makes sense to the reviewers. I imagine they're going to be focused more on the other stuff that they were focused on before.
Right. Yeah, innovation and
Mhm.
addressing public health concerns and that sort of the same sort of things that the NIH has always been looking for with grant proposals. Sure.
And I wonder if part of that question was in terms of sharing it in different databases. I wonder if you mean different data repositories. I do know that the NIH recommends selecting a data repository that has data that's most closely related to your project. For instance, if you are collecting genomic data, try to select a data repository that has the same kind of information so that people who are doing that kind of research are more likely to find it. Again, that's a recommendation, not a requirement. There are some general science data repositories that are eligible. Some of the grants will specify a data repository or you select from. For instance, the National Cancer Institute has specific data repositories that they actually offer. So it probably might have something to do with your funding agency that tells you how to do that. In terms of sharing different data sets and different repositories, that's an excellent question. And one that I would be curious to know as well. It seems to me that they're wanting all of the data to be in the same location because it applies. That's what I would imagine, but do not write that down and do not quote me. I'm very interested to find out.
Larissa shared a list of suggested repositories on the NIH site, so I passed that along as well. I believe that is in our handout that we're going to send out to you as well. If you're looking for specific data repositories list, NIH has one up on their site. Were there any other questions? And did we answer the questions that have been asked? Okay.
Well, I'd like to thank everyone so much for attending this Dear Editor session. I speak on behalf of all of my colleagues in the library. We really appreciate your interest in our services and the Research Medical Library. We are here to serve you. It is our pleasure. And should you have any questions, please reach out. We are always accessible to you, even if we're not, if it's outside of business hours, we will contact you the next day. So I will turn it back to Erica to wrap up.
Yes, let's do that. Someone says more examples, more examples. Yes, definitely check out the handout that's going out afterwards. We'll send to attendees today, you'll have a link to this recording as well as the slides. And as David said earlier, we put together a list of resources that go to some information on the NIH site, as well as they do have a number of examples of these data management sharing policies, which is very helpful. And the OSP as well has that template that you can use, which is a great place to start on this. Make sure that you're doing what you need to do to comply with the policy. But thank you everybody for joining us this morning and asking your questions. And we will see you at the next Dear Editor session. So have a great morning.
Bye, everyone.